The first President of the United States of America. George Washington, 1789 to 1797. Part 4. We continue to the first President of the United States of America. In 1832, a joint congressional committee debated moving his body from Mount Vernon to a crypt in the United States Capitol. The crypt had been built by architect Charles Bulfinch in the 1820s during the reconstruction of the burned-out Capitol, after the burning of Washington by the British during the War of 1812. Southern opposition was intense, antagonized by an ever-growing rift between North and South. Many were concerned that Washington's remains could end up on a shore foreign to his native soil if the country became divided, and Washington's remains stayed in Mount Vernon. Washington was somewhat reserved in personality, but was known for having a strong presence. He made speeches and announcements when required, but he was not a noted orator nor debater. He was taller than most of his contemporaries. Accounts of his height vary from 6 feet, 1.83 meters, to 6 feet 3.5 in 1.92 meters tall. He weighed between 210 to 220 pounds, 95 to 100 kilograms, as an adult, and was known for his great strength. He had gray-blue eyes and long reddish-brown hair. He did not wear a powdered wig. Instead, he wore his hair curled, powdered, and tied in a queue in the fashion of the day. Washington frequently suffered from severe tooth decay and ultimately lost all his teeth but one. He had several sets of false teeth during his presidency. Contrary to common lore, these were not made of wood, but of metal, ivory, bone, animal teeth, and human teeth possibly obtained from slaves. These dental problems left him in constant pain, which he treated with laudanum. Washington was a talented equestrian, with Thomas Jefferson describing him as the best horseman of his age. He collected thoroughbreds at Mount Vernon, his two favorite horses being Blueskin and Nelson. He enjoyed hunting foxes, deer, ducks, and other game. He was an excellent dancer and frequently attended the theater. He drank alcohol in moderation but was morally opposed to excessive drinking, smoking tobacco, gambling, and profanity. Washington was descended from Anglican minister Lawrence Washington, whose troubles with the Church of England may have prompted his heirs to emigrate to America. He was baptized as an infant in April 1732 and became a devoted member of the Anglican Church. He served more than 20 years as a vestryman and churchwarden at Fairfax Parish and Truro Parish in Virginia. He privately prayed and read the Bible daily, and publicly encouraged people in the nation to pray. He may have taken communion on a regular basis prior to the Revolution, but he did not do so following the war. Washington believed in a wise, inscrutable, and irresistible creator God who was active in the universe, contrary to deistic thought. He referred to God in American Enlightenment terms, including Providence, the Creator, or the Almighty, and the Divine Author or Supreme Being. He believed in a divine power who watched over battlefields, was involved in the outcome of war, protected his life, and was involved in American politics and specifically the creation of the United States. Historian Ron Chernow has argued that Washington avoided evangelistic Christianity or hellfire and brimstone speech along with communion or anything inclined to flaunt his religiosity, saying that he never used his religion as a device for partisan purposes or in official undertakings. No mention of Jesus Christ appears in his private correspondence, and such references are rare in his public writings. At the same time, Washington frequently quoted from the Bible or paraphrased it, and often referred to the Anglican Book of Common Prayer. Washington emphasized religious toleration in a nation with numerous denominations and religions. He publicly attended services of different Christian denominations and prohibited anti-Catholic celebrations in the army. He engaged workers at Mount Vernon without regard for religious belief or affiliation. While president, he acknowledged major religious sects and gave speeches on religious toleration. He was distinctly rooted in the ideas, values, and modes of thinking of the Enlightenment, but he harbored no contempt of organized Christianity and its clergy, being no bigot myself to any mode of worship. In 1793, speaking to members of the new church in Baltimore, Washington said, "We have abundant reason to rejoice that in this land the light of truth and reason has triumphed over the power of bigotry and superstition." Freemasonry was a widely accepted institution in the late 18th century, known for advocating moral teachings. Washington was attracted to the Masons' dedication to the Enlightenment principles of rationality, reason, and brotherhood. American Masonic lodges did not share the anti-clerical views of the controversial European lodges. A Masonic Lodge was established in Fredericksburg, Virginia in September 1752, and Washington was initiated 2 months later at the age of 20 as one of its first entered apprentices. Within a year, he progressed through its ranks to become a Master Mason. Washington had high regard for the Masonic order, but his lodge attendance was sporadic. In 1777, a convention of Virginia lodges asked him to be Grand Master of the newly established Grand Lodge of Virginia, but he declined due to his commitments leading the Continental Army. After 1782, he frequently corresponded with Masonic lodges and members, and served as Charter Master of Alexandria Masonic Lodge No. 22, now Alexandria Washington Lodge, No. 22, in 1788–89. In Washington's lifetime, slavery was deeply ingrained in the economic and social fabric of the colony of Virginia, which continued after the Revolution and the establishment of Virginia as a state. Slavery was legal in all of the 13 colonies prior to the American Revolution. Washington owned and rented enslaved African Americans, and during his lifetime over 577 slaves lived and worked at Mount Vernon. He inherited some, gained control of 84 dour slaves upon his marriage to Martha, and purchased at least 71 slaves between 1752 and 1773. From 1786, he rented slaves. At the time of his death he was renting 41. Prior to the Revolutionary War, Washington's view on slavery was the same as most Virginia planters of the time. Beginning in the 1760s, however, Washington gradually grew to oppose it. His first doubts were prompted by his transition from tobacco to grain crops, which left him with a costly surplus of slaves, causing him to question the system's economic efficiency. His growing disillusionment with the institution was spurred by the principles of the Revolution and revolutionary friends such as Lafayette and Hamilton. Most historians agree the Revolution was central to the evolution of Washington's attitudes on slavery. After 1783, Kenneth Morgan writes, Washington began to express inner tensions about the problem of slavery more frequently, though always in private. Regardless, Washington would remain dependent on slave labor to work his farms. The many contemporary reports of slave treatment at Mount Vernon are varied and conflicting. Historian Kenneth Morgan maintains that Washington was frugal on spending for clothes and bedding for his slaves, and only provided them with just enough food, and that he maintained strict control over his slaves, instructing his overseers to keep them working hard from dawn to dusk year-round. In contrast, historian Dorothy Tuig said, food, clothing, and housing seem to have been at least adequate. Washington faced growing debts involved with the costs of supporting slaves. He held an ingrained sense of racial superiority towards African Americans but harbored no ill feelings toward them. Some enslaved families worked at different locations on the plantation but were allowed to visit one another on their days off. Washington's slaves received 2 hours off for meals during the workday and were given time off on Sundays and religious holidays. Some accounts report that Washington opposed flogging but at times sanctioned its use, generally as a last resort, on both men and women slaves. Washington used both reward and punishment to encourage discipline and productivity in his slaves. He tried appealing to an individual's sense of pride, gave better blankets and clothing to the most deserving, and motivated his slaves with cash rewards. He believed watchfulness and admonition were better deterrents against transgressions but would punish those who will not do their duty by fair means. Punishment ranged in severity from demotion back to fieldwork, through whipping and beatings, to permanent separation from friends and family by sale. Historian Ron Scher now maintains that overseers were required to warn slaves before resorting to the lash and required Washington's written permission before whipping, though his extended absences did not always permit this. During his presidency, Washington brought several of his slaves to the federal capital. When the capital moved from New York City to Philadelphia in 1791, the president began rotating his slave household staff periodically between the capital and Mount Vernon. This was done deliberately to circumvent Pennsylvania's Slavery Abolition Act, which stated that any slave who lived there for more than 6 months was automatically freed. In May 1796, Martha's personal and favorite slave Ona Judge escaped to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. At Martha's behest, Washington attempted to capture Ona, using a treasury agent, but failed. In February 1797, around the time of his 65th birthday, Washington's personal slave Hercules Posey escaped from Mount Vernon to the north and was never found. In February 1786, Washington took a census of Mount Vernon and recorded 224 slaves. By 1799, The slave population at Mount Vernon totaled 317, including 143 children. Washington owned 124 slaves, leased 40, and held 153 for his wife's dower interest. Washington supported many slaves who were too young or too old to work, greatly increasing Mount Vernon's slave population and causing the plantation to operate at a loss. Based on his private papers and on accounts from his contemporaries, Washington slowly developed a cautious sympathy toward abolitionism that eventually ended with his will freeing his longtime valet Billy Lee, and then subsequently freeing the rest of his personally owned slaves outright upon Martha's death. As president, he remained publicly silent on the topic of slavery, believing it was a nationally divisive issue that could undermine the Union. During the Revolutionary War, Washington's views on slavery began to change. In a 1778 letter to Lund Washington, he made clear his desire to get quit of Negroes when discussing the exchange of slaves for the land he wanted to buy. The next year, Washington stated his intention not to separate enslaved families as a result of a change of masters. During the 1780s, Washington privately expressed his support for gradual emancipation. In the 1780s, he gave moral support to a plan proposed by Lafayette to purchase land and free slaves to work on it, but declined to participate in the experiment. Washington privately expressed support for emancipation to prominent Methodists Thomas Coke and Francis Asbury in 1785 but declined to sign their petition. In personal correspondence the next year, he made clear his desire to see the institution of slavery ended by a gradual legislative process, a view that correlated with the mainstream anti-slavery literature published in the 1780s that Washington possessed. He significantly reduced his purchases of slaves after the war but continued to acquire them in small numbers. In 1788, Washington declined a suggestion from a leading French abolitionist, Jacques Berceau, to establish an abolitionist society in Virginia, stating that although he supported the idea, the time was not yet right. Historian Philip D. Morgan wrote that Washington was determined not to risk national unity. 438, Washington never responded to any of the anti-slavery petitions he received, and the subject was not mentioned in either his last address to Congress or his farewell address. The first clear indication that Washington seriously intended to free his slaves appears in a letter written to his secretary, Tobias Lear, in 1794. Washington instructed Lear to find buyers for his land in Western Virginia, explaining in a private coda that he was doing so to liberate a certain species of property which I possess, very repugnantly to my own feelings. The plan, along with others Washington considered in 1795 and 1796, could not be realized because he failed to find buyers for his land, his reluctance to break up slave families, and the refusal of the Custis heirs to help prevent such separations by freeing their dower slaves at the same time. On July 9, 1799, Washington finished making his last will. The longest provision concerned slavery. All his slaves were to be freed after the death of his wife. Washington said he did not free them immediately because his slaves intermarried with his wife's dower slaves. He forbade their sale or transportation out of Virginia. The provision also provided that old and young freed people be taken care of indefinitely. Younger ones were to be taught to read and write and placed in suitable occupations. Washington emancipated 123 slaves, one of the few large slaveholding Virginians during the Revolutionary era to do so. On January 1, 1801, 1 year after George Washington's death, Martha Washington signed an order to free his slaves. Many of them, having never strayed far from Mount Vernon, were reluctant to leave. Others refused to abandon spouses or children still held as dower slaves by the Custis estate and also stayed with or near Martha. Following Washington's instructions in his will, funds were used to feed and clothe the young, aged, and infirm slaves until the early 1830s. Washington's legacy endures as one of the most influential in American history since he served as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, a hero of the Revolution, and the first President of the United States. Various historians maintain that he also was a dominant factor in America's founding. Revolutionary War comrade Henry Lee eulogized him as first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. Lee's words became the hallmark by which Washington's reputation was impressed upon the American memory, with some biographers regarding him as the great exemplar of republicanism. He set many precedents for the national government and the presidency in particular, and he was called the father of his country as early as 1778. Washington is among the highest-ranked U.S. presidents. Washington became an international symbol for liberation and nationalism as the leader of the first successful revolution against a colonial empire. The Federalists made him the symbol of their party, but the Jeffersonians continued to distrust his influence for years and delayed building the Washington Monument. Washington was elected a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences on January 31, 1781. In 1879, Congress proclaimed Washington's birthday to be a federal holiday. Through a Congressional Joint Resolution Public Law 94-479, passed on January 19, 1976, with an effective appointment date of July 4, 1976, he was posthumously appointed to the grade of General of the Armies of the United States during the American Bicentennial. President Gerald Ford stated that Washington would rank first among all officers of the Army, past and present. On March 13, 1978, Washington was militarily promoted to the rank of General of the Armies. In 1809, Mason Locke Weems wrote a hagiographic biography to honor Washington. Historian Ron Chernow maintains that Weems attempted to humanize Washington, making him look less stern, and to inspire patriotism and morality and to foster enduring myths, such as Washington's refusal to lie about damaging his father's cherry tree. Weems' accounts have never been proven or disproven. Historian John Ferling, however, maintains that Washington remains the only founder and president ever to be referred to as godlike, and points out that his character has been the most scrutinized by historians. Biographer Douglas Southall Freeman concluded, "The great big thing stamped across that man is character." Expanding on Freeman's assessment, historian David Hackett Fisher defined Washington's character as integrity, self-discipline, courage, absolute honesty, resolve, and decision, but also forbearance, decency, and respect for others. Polls of historians have consistently placed Washington among the highest-ranked of presidents. In the 21st century, Washington's reputation has been critically scrutinized. Ron Chernow describes Washington as always trying to be even-handed in dealing with the natives. He states that Washington hoped they would abandon their itinerant hunting life and adapt to fixed agricultural communities in the manner of white settlers. He also maintains that Washington never advocated outright confiscation of tribal land or the forcible removal of tribes, and that he berated American settlers who abused natives, admitting that he held out no hope for peaceful relations as long as frontier settlers entertain the opinion that there is not the same crime, or indeed no crime at all, in killing a native as in killing a white man. By contrast, Colin G. Calloway wrote that Washington had a lifelong obsession with getting Indian land, either for himself or for his nation, and initiated policies and campaigns that had devastating effects in Indian country. He stated, "The growth of the nation demanded the dispossession of Indian people. Washington hoped the process could be bloodless and that Indian people would give up their lands for a fair price and move away. But if Indians refused and resisted, as they often did, he felt he had no choice but to extirpate them, and that the expeditions he sent to destroy Indian towns were therefore entirely justified." Along with other founding fathers, Washington has been condemned for holding enslaved people. Though he expressed the desire to see the abolition of slavery come through legislation, he did not initiate or support any initiatives for bringing about its end. This has led to calls from some activists to remove his name from public buildings and his statue from public spaces. I stop at this point today. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep exploring the world's incredible stories. Soon we will publish The Second President of the United States of America, John Adams, 1797 to 1801. Thank you for watching.